Section 3, The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 3, Chapter 1, concluded. Such is the general theory of the Revolution, to which the command of Jean-Jacques Rousseau over the French tongue gave imperishable expression in that book whose style and logical connection may be compared to some exact and strong piece of engineering. He entitled it The Contrat Social, and it became the formula of the revolutionary creed. But though no man perhaps has put the prime truth of political morals so well, that truth was as old as the world. It appears in the passionate rhetoric of 100 leaders, and has stood at the head or has been woven into the laws of free states without number. In the English language, the Declaration of Independence is perhaps its noblest expression, and though this document was posterior to the great work of Rousseau, and though the genius of Jefferson was in some part descended from it, its language, and still more the actions of those who drafted and supported it, are sufficient to explain what I mean to the English readers. Now, with this general theory there stands connected on the one hand certain great principles without which it would have no meaning, and also, on the other hand, a number of minor points concerning no more than the machinery of politics. The first are vital to democracy. The second, in spite of their great popularity at the time of the Revolution, and of the sanction which the Revolution gave them, nay, of their universality, since the Revolution have in reality nothing to do with the revolutionary theory itself. Of these two categories, the type of the first is the doctrine of the equality of man. The type of the second is the mere machinery called representative. The doctrine of the equality of the man is a transcendent doctrine, a dogma, as we call such doctrines in the field of transcendental religion. It corresponds to no physical reality which we can grasp. It is hardly to be adumbrated even by metaphors drawn from physical objects. We may attempt to rationalize it by saying that what is common to all men is not more important, but infinitely more important than the accident by which men differ. We may compare human attributes to tridimensional and personal attributes to bidimensional measurements. We may say that whatever man has of his nature is all the standards of man, and we may show that in all such things men are potentially equal. None of these metaphors explains the matter, still less do any of them satisfy the demand of those to whom the dogma may be incomprehensible. Its truth is to be arrived at for these in a negative manner. If men are not equal, then no scheme of jurisprudence, no act of justice, no movement of human indignation, no exaltation of fellowship has any meaning. The doctrine of the equality of man is one which, like many of the great transcendental doctrines, may be proved by the results consequent upon its absence. It is in man to believe it, and all lively societies believe it. It is certainly not in man to prove the equality of men, save, as I have said, by negation. But it demands no considerable intellectual facility to perceive that void of the doctrine of equality. The conception of political freedom and a community's moral right to self-government disappear. Now, to believe that doctrine positively, and to believe it ardently, to go on crusade for that religious point, was indeed characteristic of the French. It required the peculiar and inherited religious temper of the French, which had for so many hundred years seized and defined point after point in the character of man, to grow enamored of this definition, and to feel it not in the intellect, but as it were in their bones. They became soldiers for it, and that enormous march of theirs overrunning Europe, which may not inaptly be compared to their adventures in the 12th century when they engaged upon the Crusades, was inspired by no one part of the doctrine of political freedom, more strongly than by this doctrine of equality. The scorn which was in those days universally felt for that pride which associates itself with the things not inherent to a man, notably and most absurdly with capricious differences of wealth, never ran higher, and the passionate sense of justice which springs from this profound and fundamental social dogma of equality, as it moved France during the Revolution to frenzy, so also moved it to creation. Those who ask how it was that a group of men sustaining all the weight of civil conflict within and of universal war without, yet made time enough in 20 years to frame the codes which govern modern Europe, to lay down the foundation of universal education, of a strictly impersonal scheme of administration, and even in detail to remodel the material face of society, in a word, to make modern Europe, must be content for their reply to learn that the Republican energy had for its flame and its excitant this vision, a sense almost physical of the equality of man. The minor points which wove themselves into the political practice of democracy during the Revolution, which are not of its principles, and which would not, were they abstracted, affect its essence, are of quite another and less noble kind. I have taken as the chief of these the machinery of deputation or of representation. The representative system had been designed for a particular purpose under the influence of the Church, and especially of the monastic orders who invented it in the Middle Ages. It had been practiced as a useful check upon the national monarchy in France, and as a useful form of national expression in times of crisis, or when national initiative was peculiarly demanded. In Spain it became, as the Middle Ages proceeded, a very vital national and local thing, varying from place to place. It is not surprising that Spain, seeing that in her territory the first experiments in representation were made, should have thus preserved it popular and alive. In England, representation, vigorous as everywhere else in the true Middle Ages, narrowed and decayed at their close, until in the 17th century it had become a mere scheme for aristocratic government. In France, for nearly 200 years before the Revolution, it had fallen into disuse, but an active memory of it still remained, especially a memory of its value in critical moments, when a consultation of the whole people was required, and when the corporate initiative of the whole people must be set at work in order to save the state. It is no wonder, therefore, that the French, on the eve of the Revolution, clamoured for a revival of representation, or, as the system was called in its French tongue, the States General. But as a permanent machine of government, no one in Europe had the least idea how the system might serve the ends of democracy. In England, democracy was not practiced, nor was representation connected with the conception of it. The nation had forgotten democracy as completely as it had forgotten the religion and the old ideals of the Middle Ages. In those parts of Christendom in which this ancient Christian institution of a parliament had not narrowed to be the mask of an oligarchy or dwindled to be a mere provincial custom, its use had disappeared. The ancient function of representation, when it had been most lively and vigorous, that is, in the Middle Ages, was occasionally to initiate a national policy in critical moments, but more generally to grant taxes. What a democratic parliament might do, no one in 1789 could conceive. There was indeed one great example of democratic representation in existence, the example of the United States. But the conditions were wholly different from those of Europe. No true central power yet existed there, no ancient central institution, no crown, nor any custom of the city. The numbers over which American representative democracy then held power were not to be compared to the 25 millions who inhabited the French realm, and even so, most of what counted in their lives was regulated by a system of highly local autonomy, for they were as scattered as they were few, and the wisest and strongest and best were dependent upon slaves. In Europe, I repeat, the experiment was untried, and it is one of the chief faults of the French revolutionaries that, having been compelled in the critical moment of the opening of the Revolution to the use of election and representation, they envisioned the permanent use of a similar machinery as something sacred to and normal in the democratic state. True, they could not foresee modern parliamentarism. Nothing could be more alien to their conception of the state than the deplorable method of government which parliamentarism everywhere tends to introduce today. True, the French people during the Revolutionary Wars made short work of parliamentary theory, and found it a more national thing to follow a soldier, being by that time all soldiers themselves, and to incarnate in a dictator the will of the nation. But though the French revolutionaries could not have foreseen what we call parliamentarism today, and though the society from which they sprang made short work of the oligarchic pretensions of a parliament when the realities of the national struggle had to be considered, yet they did, as a fact, pay an almost absurd reverence to the machinery of representation and election. They went so far as to introduce it into their attempted reform of the Church. They introduced it everywhere into civil government, from the smallest units to the highest. They even for a moment played with the illusion in that most real of games which men can ever play at, the business of arms. They allowed the election of officers. They were led to do this by that common fallacy, more excusable in them than in us, which confounds the individual will with the corporate. A representative, they thought, could in some way be the permanent receptacle of his electorate. They imagined that corporate initiative was always sufficiently active, in no matter what divisions or subdivisions, to react at once upon the delegate, to guide him as may be guided by a driven animal, or to command him as may be commanded as a servant. It was in vain that Rousseau, the great exponent of the democratic theory upon which France attempted to proceed, had warned posterity against the possible results of the representative system. They fell into the error, and it possesses many of their descendants to this day. Rousseau's searching mind perceived indeed no more than the general truth that men who consent to a representative system are free only while the representatives are not sitting. But as is so often the case with institutions of genius, though he saw not the whole of the evil, he had put his finger upon its central spot, and from that main and just principle which he laid down, that under a merely representative system men cannot be really free, flow all those evils which we now know to attach to this method of government. What a rather clumsy epigram has called the audacity of elected persons is part of this truth. The evident spectacle of modern parliamentary nations driven against their will into economic conditions which appall them proceeds again from the same truth. The conspicuous and hearty contempt into which parliamentary institutions have everywhere fallen again proceeds from it, and there proceeds from it that further derivative plague, that the representatives themselves have now everywhere become more servile than the electorate, and that in all parliamentary countries a few intriguers are the unworthy depositories of power, and by their service of finance permit the money dealers to govern us all today. Rousseau, I say, the chief prophet of the Revolution, had warned the French of this danger. It is a capital example of his talent, for the experiment of democratic representation had not yet in his time been tried, but which much more is that power of his by which he not only stamped and issued the gold of democracy as it had never till then been minted. No one man makes a people or their creed, but Rousseau more than any other man made vocal the creed of a people, and it is advisable or necessary for the reader of the Revolution to consider at the outset of his reading of what nature was Rousseau's abundant influence upon the men who remodelled the society of Europe between 1789 and 1794. Why did he dominate those 5 years, and how was it that he dominated them increasingly? An explanation of Rousseau's power merits a particular digression, for few who express themselves in the English tongue have cared to understand it, and in the academies provincial men have been content to deal with this great writer as though he were in some way inferior to themselves. The end of section 3. The end of chapter 1.